300 warships, 1 planet, 21 defenders, and every government in the galaxy had already decided not to help. This is the story of what happened anyway. The planet was called Averon. From orbit, it looked almost impossibly gentle. 3 wide oceans shimmered in deep sapphire blue, broken only by scattered chains of emerald islands, and 2 great continents that curved across the planet like open hands. Vast forests covered most of the land, dark green seas of trees that stretched for thousands of kilometers, broken by rivers that reflected the pale light of Averon's twin moons. The cities were small. Not small because the Avery lacked technology. Their ships traveled between stars, their science was advanced, and their understanding of biology was among the most respected in their region of the galaxy. Their cities were small because they preferred them that way. Most Avery settlements were quiet clusters of curved white structures built along rivers or within valleys where the wind moved gently through tall grass. From above, their cities looked less like industrial centers and more like natural patterns, as though the planet itself had grown them. The Avery were not a species that believed in dominating their world. They believed in living within it. They were tall and slender beings with smooth silver-gray skin and long, expressive fingers that allowed them remarkable precision when working with delicate instruments. Their eyes were deep blue, reflective and calm, and their voices carried a musical softness that other species often described as strangely reassuring. In galactic politics, the Avery were considered a minor civilization. Not weak, simply quiet. For almost 2 centuries, Averon had been a member of the Galactic Concord, a vast alliance of hundreds of star-faring species bound together by treaties, economic agreements, and mutual defense protocols. The Concord liked to describe itself as the stabilizing force of the galaxy. Its council chambers stretched across an entire orbital station near the galactic core, where diplomats from dozens of civilizations debated trade routes, border disputes, and the slow-shifting politics of interstellar power. The Avery had a seat there, but they rarely spoke. Their representative, Elder Valeth, had served on the council for almost 40 years, and during that time he had developed a reputation for patience and restraint. Valeth believed in the Concord. He believed in the idea that many species, each different and imperfect in their own way, could still build something stable together. It was a hopeful belief. On Averon itself, life moved at the same calm rhythm it always had. Farmers tended floating agricultural platforms in the planet's shallow coastal seas. Students walked quiet stone paths between the learning halls of the capital city Illira, their discussions drifting through the warm afternoon air. Medical researchers worked in glass-walled laboratories overlooking forests older than most civilizations. And every evening, when the twin moons rose together above the horizon, people gathered along the riverbanks that ran through the capital city. Music was played. Soft lights reflected on the water. Families sat together beneath tall trees that had been growing since long before the Avery first reached space. The galaxy beyond their world could be loud and dangerous, but Averon had always been peaceful. That peace was not accidental. The Avery had chosen it. Their defense fleet existed, of course. Membership in the Galactic Concord required every civilization to maintain a modest military presence capable of protecting trade lanes and responding to border threats. But Avery ships were rarely seen outside their system. They were patrol vessels, not warships. Tools of security, not conquest. For nearly 200 years, that had been enough. The Concord protected its members. Or at least that was what everyone believed. On the evening before everything changed, Elder Valeth stood on the highest balcony of the Concord Embassy in Illira and watched the 2 moons rise over the river. Below him, the city glowed with soft amber lights. Somewhere nearby, a group of musicians were playing an old melody that had been passed down through generations. Valeth listened to it quietly. He had spent most of his life working with other civilizations. He had seen political tension, territorial disputes, and more than a few military confrontations between rival species. But the Concord had always held. Slowly, imperfectly, but it held. And Averon had remained safe. The stars above the city were bright that night. Bright enough that one of the embassy's junior communications officers noticed something unusual when she checked the deep space monitoring network shortly before midnight. A pattern. a faint cluster of signals appearing far beyond the outer sensor boundary of the Averon system. At first, the readings looked like noise, sensor ghosts, but as she watched, the signals grew stronger, and then stronger again. She leaned forward in her chair and began running additional scans. Numbers started appearing across her screen, long columns of them, coordinates, velocity vectors, mass signatures. Her fingers froze above the console, because she suddenly understood what she was looking at. A fleet, a very large fleet, moving directly toward Averon. The first person to fully understand the sensor data was Lieutenant Sarantau, the communications officer on night watch at the Averon Deep Space Monitoring Array. Saran had worked the monitoring station for almost 5 years. Most nights were quiet, routine traffic from merchant ships, distant research probes sending periodic updates, the usual background noise of a civilized star system. Nothing about the incoming readings looked routine. At first, it was only a cluster of faint signals. Then the system's automated scanners began resolving them. Mass signatures, engine emissions, formation patterns. Saran leaned closer to the screen, her long silver fingers hovering above the console as the computer refined its calculations. More data appeared. 1 ship, then 6, then 20. Her heart began to beat faster. The numbers continued climbing. 40, 80, 100. The system's threat analysis program activated automatically and began marking each signature with a red icon. Saran ran the scan again, then again. The result didn't change. By the time the system completed its full long-range sweep, the display had stopped listing individual vessels entirely. Instead, a single number appeared at the top of the screen. 312. Saran felt a sudden chill move through her chest. 312 warships, moving in coordinated formation, and every one of them was heading directly toward Averon. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved quickly across the console, routing the data through the planetary defense network and marking the report maximum priority. Within 30 seconds, alarms began sounding across the Averon Defense Command Center. Elder Valeth was awakened just before dawn. The messenger who arrived at his residence spoke quietly but urgently. "Elder," the young officer said, bowing quickly. "You are needed at the Embassy Command Center immediately." Valeth had served his people long enough to recognize the tone. Something serious had happened. He dressed quickly and followed the officer through the quiet streets of Illyra as emergency vehicles began moving through the city. By the time they reached the embassy tower, the sky over the river had begun turning pale blue with morning light. Inside the command center, dozens of analysts and officers stood around the central display table. The room fell silent when Valeth entered. A tall defense officer stepped forward. "Elder," she said carefully, "you need to see this." She activated the display. A three-dimensional map of the Averon star system appeared in the air above the table. At the far edge of the system, hundreds of red icons glowed like a spreading storm. Valeth studied the formation quietly. "How many?" he asked. 312 confirmed, the officer replied. "Possibly more. Some signals are still resolving." Valeth nodded slowly. "Identification?" The officer hesitated for a moment. Then she answered, "The Dravari Dominion." The room grew very still. The Dravari were not a rumor. They were not a distant political concern discussed in council chambers. They were a fact. Over the past 30 years, the Dravari Dominion had expanded across an entire region of the outer spiral arm. 12 civilizations had attempted to resist them. 12 had failed. The Dravari did not attack impulsively. They did not raid or threaten. They studied. They calculated. And when they moved with overwhelming force. Every campaign followed the same pattern. A massive fleet would appear without warning. Planetary defenses would resist briefly. Then the system would fall. Some worlds were conquered. Others were simply stripped of resources and abandoned. The Concord had debated the Dravari threat many times. Resolutions had been proposed. Committees had been formed. But the Dominion had always remained just outside the official borders of Concord space. Until now. Valeth looked again at the approaching fleet. "They are certain of victory," he said quietly. The defense officer nodded. "Yes." Estimated arrival? 42 hours. The room remained silent. 42 hours was not enough time to build a fleet. It was not enough time to evacuate a planet. It was barely enough time to prepare defenses. Valeth folded his hands behind his back and looked at the red icons slowly moving across the display. The Avery Defense Fleet consisted of 21 patrol ships. Good ships, well-maintained, but they had never been designed to face 300 warships. Not alone. After a moment, Valeth spoke again. "Send a distress signal," he said calmly. "To the Concord Council. Highest priority." The officer nodded immediately. "Yes, Elder." Valeth watched the display as technicians began transmitting the signal across every major communication channel in the sector. The message was simple. Averon is under threat. Dravari fleet approaching. Immediate assistance requested. The Concord existed for moments like this. Or at least that was what everyone had always believed. Valeth stood quietly beside the display table and watched the distress signal leave the system, traveling outward through the dark between stars, carrying a single request to the rest of the galaxy. "Help us." The distress signal left Averon at dawn. It traveled as a wideband emergency broadcast, transmitted simultaneously across dozens of frequencies, and routed through the fastest communication relays the Galactic Concord maintained. Within minutes, the signal began reaching the outer listening stations scattered across nearby systems. Within an hour, it had reached the central relay hubs of the Concord itself. In theory, the system worked very well. Every member civilization of the Concord had agreed to the same rules centuries earlier. When a distress signal from a member world was received, it would immediately be elevated to the Emergency Response Council, where a rapid decision could be made about intervention. The system existed precisely to prevent disasters like the ones the Dravari Dominion had already caused. At least, that was the theory. In practice, things were slower. Much slower. The first official acknowledgement arrived 3 hours after the signal was transmitted. Elder Valeth was standing in the embassy communications chamber when the message appeared on the main display. The text was short. "Distress signal received. Situation under review by Concord Security Council. Further updates will follow." Valeth read the message once. Then he nodded. "Send them all available sensor data," he said. Technicians immediately began transmitting the complete analysis of the incoming Dravari fleet, formation patterns, engine signatures, estimated arrival time. Everything. The more information the Council had, the faster they could act. That was the hope. By midday, additional responses began arriving. The first came from the Terran Federation, one of the largest economic powers in the Concord. Their message was polite and careful. The Terran Federation expresses deep concern regarding the developing situation in the Averon system. "We urge all parties to seek diplomatic channels before military escalation." Valeth read it without expression. Diplomatic channels. The Dravari Dominion had never once responded to diplomatic channels. Not in 30 years. The next message arrived from the Halvori Collective. Their reply was longer and more complicated. The collective recognizes the seriousness of the threat facing Averon. However, the mobilization of Concord military forces requires formal council authorization under treaty protocols. Emergency discussions are currently scheduled. Scheduled? Valeth asked quietly. "When?" A communications officer checked the attached file. "In 18 hours, she said. 18 hours. The Dravari fleet would reach Averon in 42. The council would spend nearly half of that time simply beginning their discussion." Valeth said nothing. By evening, the responses had formed a pattern. Some civilizations expressed sympathy. Others expressed concern. Several acknowledged the situation but explained that their fleets were currently committed to defensive operations elsewhere. One message arrived from the powerful Vaskari Empire. It was the shortest of them all. "We regret that we cannot intervene in this matter at this time." That was it. No explanation. No offer of assistance. Just regret. Inside the Averon Defense Command Center, the mood had grown quiet. The technicians continued working. The defense fleet prepared for battle. Civilian evacuation plans were activated for several major cities. But everyone in the room understood the numbers. 21 Avery patrol ships against 300 Dravari warships. Even with planetary defense platforms assisting them, the outcome was obvious. The Concord was supposed to prevent exactly this situation. Yet the hours continued passing, and no fleets were coming. Late that night, another message arrived from the Concord Council itself. Valeth stood beside the display as the transmission opened. The message was delivered by an artificial diplomatic interface, its voice perfectly calm. "The Concord Security Council has reviewed the Averon distress signal. The Council acknowledges the seriousness of the threat. However, Consensus regarding military intervention has not yet been reached. Valeth closed his eyes briefly. The voice continued. Further discussion will take place at the next emergency session scheduled in 24 hours. 24 hours. The Dravari fleet would arrive in less than 20. The council meeting would happen after Aveyron was already under attack. The message ended with a final line. The Concord expresses its sincere hope for a peaceful resolution to this situation. The transmission closed. The command center remained silent for several seconds. Finally, one of the younger officers spoke quietly. Elder, does this mean no one is coming? Valeth looked at the tactical display where the red icons of the Dravari fleet had moved noticeably closer. Then he answered with the same calm voice he had used his entire career. It means, he said carefully, that we should prepare to defend our world ourselves. Across the room, the communications network continued broadcasting the Aveyron distress signal into deep space. Again and again, the message traveled through star systems, relay stations, and listening arrays across the Concord's territory. Most civilizations had already heard it. Most had already chosen their response. Concern, sympathy, discussion, but no ships, no fleets, no help. The signal continued moving outward through the darkness between stars, carrying the voice of a small civilization calling for help, past the borders of Concord space, into the dark regions of the outer spiral arm, into star systems that were barely mapped, into territories where only a few small civilizations had ever been recorded. The signal kept moving, and somewhere in that darkness, someone heard it. The signal reached Earth at 3:12 coordinated planetary time. Most of the planet was asleep. Cities across Europe and Africa were quiet under the late-night sky. North America was deep in the early hours of morning. In Asia, the first light of dawn had just begun touching the horizon. But inside the United Earth Defense Command headquarters in Geneva, the lights were always on. They had been for decades. Trouble in space rarely followed a convenient schedule. The Aveyron distress signal arrived through one of the deep space monitoring arrays orbiting Jupiter and was automatically forwarded through several layers of communication networks before reaching the command center on Earth. Within seconds, it appeared on the console of the night duty officer. Commander Elena Reyes was halfway through a routine traffic report when the alert indicator flashed red across her screen. She paused. Emergency broadcasts were rare. Wideband distress signals from outside human territory were even rarer. She opened the transmission. The translation system worked quickly, converting the Avery language into standard Earth English. The message appeared in clear text. Aveyron under attack. Dravari Dominion fleet approaching. Immediate assistance requested. Reyes read the message twice. Then she leaned back in her chair and pulled up the attached sensor data. The tactical overlay resolved slowly. Hundreds of ships. A tight siege formation. Estimated arrival time less than 10 hours. She exhaled slowly. That's not good, she murmured. She tapped the alert panel. Wake the Admiral, she told the system. Admiral Jonathan Hale had been in the military for 36 years. He had served on destroyers, commanded a carrier group, and spent the last 6 years overseeing the United Earth Defense Command's deep space operations. He had also learned something important during those decades. Bad news almost always arrived in the middle of the night. When the call came through, he was awake within seconds. By the time he entered the command center 15 minutes later, he was already dressed in uniform. The room quieted slightly as he approached the central command table. Commander Reyes stood beside the display. Admiral, she said, handing him a data tablet. Emergency broadcast from an alien civilization called the Avery. They're under attack. Hale read the message silently. Then he studied the fleet data. Dravari Dominion, he said. Reyes nodded. We've got some intelligence files on them from Concord Space. Expansionist Empire. They've wiped out a dozen civilizations over the last 30 years. Hale's eyes moved across the tactical display. 300 warships. Aveyron had 21. That part of the equation didn't take long to understand. How far away, he asked. 4 standard FTL jumps, Reyes replied. If we move immediately, the fleet could reach them shortly after the Dravari arrive. Hale stood quietly for a moment. Another officer spoke carefully from the far side of the room. Admiral, there's a complication. Hale looked up. The Avery are members of the Galactic Concord, the officer said. Technically, this falls under their jurisdiction. If we intervene without authorization, we'll be violating Concord military protocols. He pulled up a secondary report on the display. The consequences could be serious, sir. Formal sanctions, loss of trade agreements, reduced diplomatic standing across the entire Concord. We're not yet full members. An unsanctioned military action in their territory could set our status back by decades. Some council members might move to formally exclude us. Several people in the room nodded. Hale read the list himself. He read all of it. Then he placed the tablet down on the command table. Has the Concord responded? He asked. Reyes checked the communication logs. They acknowledged the signal, she said. And they're reviewing the situation. Hale nodded slowly. Of course they were. He had seen that kind of response before. Committees, meetings, debates. By the time those finished, the planet would already be burning. He looked at the distress message still glowing on the screen. Immediate assistance requested. He placed the tablet down on the command table. Get Fleet Command on the line, he said calmly. Several officers glanced at one another. Admiral, one of them said carefully. Are we considering intervention? Hale looked at the tactical display again. Then he answered. Someone asked for help. The room remained silent. Another officer cleared his throat. With respect, sir, this isn't technically our conflict. Hale turned toward him. No, he said. It isn't. He gestured toward the screen where the Aveyron distress message still glowed. But they asked anyway. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Commander Reyes nodded once and began entering commands into her console. Contacting Fleet Command, she said. Within seconds, the encrypted channel opened. A holographic interface appeared above the command table. Fleet readiness reports began streaming across the display. Hale watched them scroll past. Destroyers, carriers, heavy cruisers, patrol squadrons stationed throughout the Sol system and nearby colonies. How fast can we assemble a task force? He asked. Reyes scanned the readiness data. If we mobilize everything available in this sector, we could have roughly 400 ships ready within 6 hours. Hill considered that number. 400. Against 300 Dravari. Not comfortable odds, but better than 21. He folded his arms behind his back and looked around the room. Send the order, he said. Reyes looked up. Yes, Admiral. All available combat vessels, Hale continued. Full mobilization. Priority launch. Another officer asked the obvious question. What's the mission objective, sir? Hale's voice remained steady. We're going to Aveyron. He glanced once more at the distress message glowing on the screen. They asked for help, he said quietly. So we're going to help. Across the command center, dozens of officers began moving at once. Orders were transmitted. Ships received mobilization alerts. Fleet commanders were awakened across human-controlled space. Within minutes, the first engines in orbit around Earth began powering up. And across the solar system, hundreds of human warships started preparing to move. For the people of Aveyron, the night was almost over. The Dravari fleet was less than 8 hours away. They believed no one was coming. They were wrong. The mobilization order spread across human space in less than a minute. It traveled through encrypted military channels, across relay satellites orbiting distant colonies, through deep space communication arrays anchored near asteroid belts and research stations scattered across the outer planets. The message itself was simple. All available combat vessels. Emergency deployment. Rally coordinates attached. Within seconds, hundreds of ships began to respond. In high orbit above Mars, the heavy cruiser UES Vanguard powered up its fusion drives while technicians scrambled through the engineering decks, completing launch procedures that normally took hours in a matter of minutes. Captain Arjun Patel stood on the bridge watching the mobilization order scroll across the main display. Destination? He asked. The navigation officer enlarged the tactical map. Outer Orion Arms, sir. Planet called Aveyron. Patel studied the coordinates. That's a long way from home. The communications officer looked up from her console. Distress signal, Captain. Alien civilization under attack. Patel nodded once. Then let's not keep them waiting. Engines ready, the engineer reported. Release docking clamps. Outside the viewport, the Vanguard slowly drifted free from the orbital shipyard and began accelerating toward the rally point. Near the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, a squadron of destroyers broke formation from routine patrol and turned toward the same coordinates. The ships moved quickly, their engines flaring bright blue as they shifted on to intercept trajectories that would lead them out of the solar system. Across the inner planets, similar movements were happening everywhere. Frigates left escort duty around cargo convoys. Heavy carriers powered up their launch systems. Defense platforms transferred fighter wings to mobile command ships. Human space had been quiet for months. Now, suddenly, it was alive with motion. 6 hours after the first order was issued, the assembly point outside Neptune's orbit had transformed into something remarkable. Ships arrived from every direction. Long lines of destroyers glided into formation. Massive carrier vessels took position at the center of the growing fleet. Support ships, medical transports, and supply vessels joined the formation one by one. The fleet kept growing. 200 ships, then 300, then more. At the center of it all was the flagship, the UES Resolute Horizon. From a distance, the ship looked almost understated compared to some alien warships described in Concord intelligence files. It had no ornamental structures, no dramatic winged hull sections, or intimidating spikes meant to project power. It was built the way human warships always were. Functional. Efficient. Everything on its hull existed for a purpose. Armor plates layered carefully across the ship's frame. Weapon systems integrated into the structure itself. Sensor arrays positioned to cover every angle of surrounding space. The ship was large not for spectacle, but because the job required it. Inside the bridge of the Resolute Horizon, Admiral Jonathan Hale watched the fleet assemble on the tactical display. Hundreds of icons slowly settled into formation. Commander Reyes stood beside him reviewing the final readiness reports. Current count is 482 vessels, she said. Hale raised an eyebrow slightly. That's more than expected. Several outer colony patrol groups volunteered to join the operation, Reyes replied. They requested authorization to participate. Hale nodded. Approved. Reyes entered the command into the system. Outside the viewport, the last arrivals slid smoothly into position among the others. A fleet of nearly 500 human ships now hovered silently in deep space beyond Neptune. From the perspective of a distant observer, it would have looked like a small artificial constellation suddenly appearing in the darkness. Inside the fleet formation, crews prepared for long-range transit. Engineers calibrated jump drives. Medical teams secured emergency wards. Fighter pilots climbed into their cockpits. On hundreds of bridges across the fleet, officers studied the same tactical projection of the Averon system. 300 Dravari warships. A siege formation descending toward a peaceful world. They had seen similar scenarios before in historical briefings. But this time, humanity was part of the equation. Back on the bridge of the Resolute Horizon, Admiral Hale walked slowly toward the central command chair. The final readiness report appeared on the main display. Fleet status, ready for jump. Commander Reyes glanced at him. Admiral, she said quietly, once we enter Concord space, this becomes official. Hale understood what she meant. The Concord Council might not appreciate an unsanctioned human fleet suddenly appearing in their territory. Political consequences would follow, but that problem could wait. He looked again at the tactical overlay of Averon. The Dravari fleet had already entered the system. The first orbital defense platforms had begun exchanging fire. The battle had started. Hale sat down in the command chair. All ships, he said over the fleet channel. Hundreds of bridges fell silent as every commander listened. Set jump coordinates. Navigation officers across the fleet locked in a long sequence of hyperspace jumps that would carry them toward Averon. The stars outside began to distort slightly as the massive engines prepared for faster-than-light transit. Hale took a slow breath. Then he gave the order. Fleet. He paused only for a moment. Jump. Across the darkness beyond Neptune, 482 ships ignited their drives. For 3 seconds, space itself seemed to tear open with brilliant streaks of light. Then the fleet vanished, and humanity began moving toward the sound of someone calling for help. The human fleet moved through hyperspace in complete silence. Outside the hulls of the ships, normal space no longer existed. The stars had stretched into long ribbons of pale light as the fleet traveled faster than anything built by the Avery or the Dravari had ever recorded. Inside the ships, however, life continued with the steady rhythm of a military deployment. Crew members ran diagnostics. Fighter pilots reviewed combat scenarios. Engineers monitored reactor output and hyperspace drive stability. On the bridge of the Resolute Horizon, Admiral Jonathan Hale stood beside the large forward viewport, though there was little to see except the distorted glow of hyperspace. Commander Reyes approached him quietly. "Admiral," she said, handing him a data tablet, "you should probably see this." Hale glanced down. "What is it?" "Historical records," she replied. "About the Avery." Hale raised an eyebrow slightly. "I thought we didn't know much about them." "We didn't," Reyes said. "But intelligence has been pulling old archives since the signal came in." Hale began reading. The file dated back nearly 90 years. Long before humanity had built a fleet capable of crossing large sections of the galaxy. Back when Earth had only a handful of colonies scattered across nearby star systems. The title of the document was simple: The Helios Plague. Hale remembered hearing the name once during a military academy lecture, but he had never known the full story. He continued reading. In the year 2167, a biological pathogen had appeared on one of humanity's early deep space colonies. At first, it seemed manageable, but the disease spread quickly. Within weeks, it had moved beyond the original colony. Within months, it had reached multiple systems. The infection attacked the human immune system directly, weakening it until even minor illnesses became fatal. Entire settlements collapsed. Hospitals overflowed. Research teams worked around the clock trying to isolate the pathogen and develop a treatment. Nothing worked. The projections were devastating. If a solution was not found within 2 years, billions of people could die. Humanity had asked for help. Requests had been sent to every known alien civilization, to the Concord Council, to independent research institutes across the galaxy. Most responses had been sympathetic, but distant. Many civilizations simply did not possess compatible medical knowledge. Others refused involvement in what they considered an internal human crisis. The Concord had acknowledged the situation. Committees had discussed possible responses. But time was passing faster than bureaucracy, and people were dying. Then, without warning, a transmission arrived. A massive encrypted data package. No diplomatic introduction. No formal explanation. Just medical research. The data contained detailed biological analysis of the Helios pathogen, immune response simulations, treatment protocols. Within weeks, human scientists used the information to develop the first effective antiviral therapy. The death rate dropped almost immediately. Within a year, the plague was under control. Billions of lives saved. Hale reached the end of the report. He looked up slowly. "The Avery sent this?" he asked. Reyes nodded. "Yes." Hale turned the tablet slightly, reading one of the final notes in the archive. According to Concord diplomatic records, the Avery had violated multiple trade and research agreements when they sent the data. Medical technology of that level was normally restricted under Concord law. Sharing it outside official channels created political complications. The Avery government had been quietly penalized afterward. Reduced trade privileges. Loss of influence within the Concord Council. They had accepted those consequences without protest. And they had never once mentioned the help they had given humanity. Reyes spoke again. "They never asked for anything in return." Hale remained silent. He looked again at the tactical display hovering above the command table. The Averon system glowed faintly in the projection. A small green planet. A civilization that had quietly saved billions of human lives decades earlier. And never told anyone. Hale handed the tablet back. "So that's why intelligence flagged this mission as priority," he said. Reyes nodded again. "The files were classified for years. But the moment the distress signal arrived, the system recognized the species' name." She paused slightly. "Some deaths," she said, "take a long time to repay." Hale looked out through the viewport again. The swirling glow of hyperspace stretched endlessly ahead of them. Somewhere beyond it, a small planet was fighting for survival. A civilization that had helped humanity when no one else would. And now they were the ones calling for help. Hale folded his hands behind his back. "Well," he said quietly, "then it's a good thing we answered." The battle above Averon had already begun. The first Dravari ships entered orbit shortly after sunrise. From the surface of the planet, they appeared as small dark shapes moving slowly across the sky, silent shadows against the pale blue atmosphere. But in orbit, the situation was far less calm. The Avery defense fleet had taken position in a thin arc between the planet and the incoming Dravari formation. 21 patrol ships, small compared to the massive war vessels advancing toward them. But they were all the Avery had, and they were fighting. Energy beams flashed across space as the first defensive platforms opened fire. Several Dravari ships responded immediately, their heavier weapons striking the outer platforms with terrifying precision. Within minutes, 2 stations had already gone dark. On the bridge of the Avery flagship Silver Horizon, Captain Thera Valen watched the battle unfold across the tactical display. "Maintain defensive spread," she ordered calmly. Her officers obeyed without hesitation. The patrol ships moved quickly, using their smaller size and faster maneuvering to avoid the heaviest incoming fire. But the numbers were overwhelming. 300 Dravari ships were tightening their formation, slowly pushing forward like a massive iron wall. Thera knew how this battle would end. They all did. But that didn't change their duty. "Target their forward cruisers," she said. "If we can slow the central group, the orbital batteries will have more time." Outside the ship, the defense fleet surged forward again. Small vessels darting around the larger enemy ships, striking where they could. Several Dravari cruisers took damage. One even lost engine power and drifted away from the formation. But the Dominion fleet barely slowed. High above the battlefield, aboard the Dravari command ship Iron Dominion, General Carveth Drall watched the engagement with quiet confidence. Drall was an experienced commander. He had overseen the conquest of 4 civilizations personally. The pattern was always the same. First resistance, then exhaustion, then surrender. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back as the tactical display showed the Avery fleet slowly losing ground. "Estimated time to orbital dominance?" he asked. One of his officers answered immediately. 2 hours, General." Drall nodded. The Avery ships were fighting bravely. But bravery did not change mathematics. 300 warships against 21. The outcome was inevitable. He turned his attention briefly to the surface of the planet visible through the large viewing window. A peaceful world. Green continents. Bright oceans. Cities scattered gently across the land. Soon it would belong to the Dominion, just like the 12 worlds before it. Then the sensors began to change. At first, the anomaly appeared as a faint distortion at the very edge of the system's detection range. One of the Dravari sensor officers noticed it first. He frowned slightly at his console. "General, we're detecting something." Drall didn't turn immediately. "Clarify." "FTL signatures," the officer said. "Multiple." Drall walked slowly toward the sensor station. "How many?" The officer hesitated. "The system is still resolving the readings." More signatures appeared. 5, then 10, then 20. Drall's expression shifted slightly. "Are these Concord vessels?" he asked. "Unknown," the officer replied. The numbers continued climbing. 30, 50, 100. Now the entire sensor room had gone silent. The display struggled to track the incoming signals as more and more ships began dropping out of faster-than-light transit at the outer edge of the system. The computer switched from individual tracking to a single fleet estimate. The number appeared at the top of the screen. 482. The room remained completely silent. Drall stared at the number. Then he looked at the formation pattern appearing across the tactical display. 482 ships, arriving almost simultaneously, forming organized combat positions, and placing themselves directly between the Dravari fleet and the planet below. The communications officer spoke quietly. "General, we are receiving a transmission." Drall nodded. "Put it through." The voice that came over the channel was calm, clear, confident. "This is Admiral Jonathan Hale of the United Earth Defense Command. You are attacking a world that requested assistance. You now have 20 minutes to withdraw from this system." Drall stared at the tactical display. 482 unknown warships, positioned in a formation he had never seen before. He had expected fear. He had expected negotiation. Instead, someone had come to fight. For a few seconds after the transmission ended, the bridge of the Iron Dominion remained completely silent. General Carveth Drall stared at the tactical display. 482 ships. Unknown design. Unknown doctrine. Unknown weapons. The database began pulling what little information existed about the species that had just announced themselves. The results appeared quickly. Species: human. Civilization age: interstellar, 80 years. Fleet size estimate: limited. Drall frowned slightly. 80 years. That was barely a beginning. Most civilizations required centuries to build fleets capable of large-scale warfare. Yet the sensor display clearly showed nearly 500 ships, and they had arrived quickly, very quickly. He studied the formation. It was strange. Most fleets arranged themselves into defensive arcs or solid battle lines. Human ships had done neither. Instead, they hovered in what looked like a loose sphere around the Dravari fleet. Not aggressive, but not defensive either. Waiting, observing, measuring. Draal turned to the communications officer. Respond. The channel reopened. This system, Draal said calmly, is under the authority of the Dravari Dominion. Your presence here constitutes interference in an active military campaign. He paused slightly. Withdraw your vessels immediately. The answer came back almost instantly. This is Admiral Hale, the voice said again. You have 19 minutes left. No anger. No threats. Just a simple statement. Draal ended the transmission. For the first time in the campaign, he felt a small flicker of something he rarely experienced. Uncertainty. He turned to his officers. Maintain formation, he ordered. The Dravari fleet remained steady. 300 warships held position in their massive siege pattern. Draal did not intend to retreat, but he also did not intend to attack blindly. He had conquered 12 civilizations by studying his opponents carefully, and something about the human fleet felt unusual. On the bridge of the resolute horizon, Admiral Hale watched the same tactical map from the opposite perspective. Commander Reyes stood beside him, analyzing the Dravari formation. They're holding position, she said. They think we're bluffing. Hale nodded slightly. That's reasonable. The Dravari fleet had spent decades crushing weaker civilizations. They expected conventional warfare. Two fleets meeting head-on. Power against power. Numbers against numbers. That was not how humans preferred to fight. Hale turned toward the tactical station where Commander Malik Chun, the fleet's senior combat strategist, was working through several simulation models. Chun had 6 holographic screens open around him, each displaying a different angle of the battlefield. How does it look? Hale asked. Chun didn't look up immediately. They're disciplined, he said. Their formation is designed for mass compression. If we attack head-on, they'll concentrate fire and break our front line, which we're not going to do. No, Chun agreed. He tapped one of the holographic projections. This fleet has fought the same way for 30 years. Heavy central assault. Overwhelming numbers. He enlarged the model. That makes them predictable. Hale watched the projection. Chun continued. They assume fleets behave like armies. One direction, one main line of attack. He highlighted 11 different points around the Dravari formation. So we don't do that. Hale smiled faintly. Good. At exactly 20 minutes after the warning was delivered, Hale gave the command. All ships, he said over the fleet channel. Hundreds of human vessels immediately shifted from idle formation to full combat readiness. Weapons powered up. Targeting systems locked onto enemy vessels. Pilots prepared their fighters. Execute maneuver pattern Atlas 7, Hale said calmly. Across the fleet, commanders acknowledged the order. And then the formation changed. The Dravari sensors detected the movement instantly, but the pattern made no sense. Instead of charging forward as expected, the human fleet suddenly split apart. Not into 2 groups. Not into 4. Into 11 separate formations. Each group of ships accelerated in a different direction simultaneously. Some climbed above the orbital plane. Others dove below it. Several curved outward before swinging back toward the Dravari formation from the sides. From the perspective of the Dravari tactical display, the human fleet suddenly looked like a hand opening its fingers. Draal leaned forward slightly. What are they doing? His sensor officers struggled to keep up with the movement. Multiple vectors forming, General. How many? 11 attack groups. Draal frowned. 11. No fleet doctrine in the Dravari archives used 11 divisions. It was tactically inefficient. Too many moving parts. Too much room for error. But the human ships were moving with incredible coordination. Each group accelerating quickly, adjusting course with precision. The Dravari fleet attempted to reorient its formation. But the siege configuration was designed to push forward in a single direction. Breaking it apart required time. Time they no longer had. The first human strikes hit seconds later. 3 separate groups attacked simultaneously from different angles. But they didn't aim for the Dravari fleet's strongest ships. Instead, they targeted specific vessels on the edges of the formation. communication relays, shield support cruisers, navigation control ships, precise targets. The Dravari shields absorbed several hits, but others slipped through gaps in their defenses. 2 ships lost power immediately. Another began drifting out of formation. Dral's eyes narrowed. "They're not trying to destroy us," he said quietly. "They're disrupting the structure." Then the Dravari adapted. A cluster of heavy cruisers on the Dravari's eastern flank broke from the main formation and turned to intercept one of the human destroyer squadrons that had moved too deep into their firing arc. The cruisers opened fire with everything they had. The human destroyers scattered, but not fast enough. 3 ships took catastrophic hits in rapid succession. One broke apart completely, its hull splitting open in a sudden silent flash. Another lost engine power and went dark, tumbling slowly away from the battle. The third managed to limp clear, but was no longer combat capable. On the resolute horizon, the damage report came in within seconds. Chen's voice was tight, but controlled. "We've lost the Ardennes. Kestrel and Meridian are disabled. The eastern vector is exposed. If those cruisers push through that gap, they'll have a clear line to the fleet's center." Hale looked at the tactical display. The gap was real. The cruisers were already accelerating toward it. He had 2 options. Pull Formation 7 back to close the breach, but that would take 3 minutes, and it would uncover the southern approach. Or redirect Group 9 from their flanking run, which would delay the encirclement by 20 minutes and give the Dravari time to reorient. Either choice had a cost. "Pull Formation 7, Hale said. "Redirect Group 9 to cover the breach." "Do it now." "Sir, that delays the encirclement." "I know. Do it." Across the fleet, the orders went out. Formation 7 pulled back. Group 9 broke from their flanking arc and turned to intercept the advancing cruisers. For nearly 4 minutes, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The Dravari cruisers exchanged heavy fire with Group 9 at point-blank range. 2 more human ships took serious damage. But the gap closed. The line held. And the encirclement, delayed but not broken, resumed. Across the battlefield, the 11 human groups continued moving. Not charging, not retreating, circling, weaving through space like hunters surrounding a much larger animal. Every few seconds, another coordinated strike hit a weak point in the Dravari formation. Engines, shield relays, targeting systems. The Dominion fleet had never fought an opponent like this. Their ships were built for brute force engagements. Heavy armor, heavy weapons, direct confrontations. But the humans refused to fight that way. They stayed just outside the optimal firing arcs. Striking, moving, striking again. From the bridge of the resolute horizon, Commander Chen watched the tactical display carefully. "They're adapting," he said. Hale nodded. They would, but not fast enough. The display showed the Dravari fleet beginning to compress inward. Exactly as Chun had predicted. Their ships instinctively moved closer together for protection. But that was the trap. The 11 human groups were slowly guiding them. Hurting them, not destroying the fleet. Positioning it for something much worse. Chen finally looked up from his screens. "They're almost in the box," he said. Hale folded his arms. "Good." For nearly 2 hours, the battle above Aveyron continued in a pattern that confused the Dravari commanders. Human ships moved constantly. They never held position long enough for the Dravari fleet to bring its full firepower to bear. Instead, they struck with quick precision attacks, targeting engines, shield generators, and sensor arrays before disappearing into new attack vectors. To an outside observer, the battlefield might have looked chaotic, but it was anything but. Every maneuver had a purpose. Every strike pushed the Dravari fleet slightly closer to a very specific position. On the bridge of the Iron Dominion, General Carveth Dral watched the tactical map with growing concern. His officers were issuing orders rapidly now. Group 3, reinforce the northern flank. Cruisers 12 through 16 reposition. Bring the heavy batteries online. But the commands were becoming harder to coordinate. Because the battlefield was no longer a single front. The human fleet had fractured the engagement into multiple smaller conflicts happening simultaneously. 11 separate combat groups. 11 constantly shifting angles of attack. And every time the Dravari ships attempted to counter one threat, another appeared somewhere else. Dral's fleet was powerful, but it had been designed for overwhelming assault tactics. Not this. Not a fight where the enemy refused to engage directly. Then the sensor officer spoke again. General. Drawl turned. Yes. The human formations are tightening. The tactical display zoomed out automatically. Drawl studied the pattern. The 11 human groups had been spreading outward for most of the battle. Now they were moving inward again. But not randomly. The ships were forming a sphere. A slow, deliberate enclosure around the Dravari fleet. Every possible escape vector was gradually being sealed. Drawl's eyes narrowed. They've been guiding us, he said quietly. One of his officers looked confused. General? For 2 hours, Drawl continued. They have been shaping our movement. He pointed at the tactical map. They never intended to break our fleet. Another officer leaned forward. They're surrounding us. The sensor display confirmed it. Human ships now occupied every major approach vector around the Dravari formation. Above the orbital plane. Below it. To the east and west of the battlefield. Hundreds of vessels forming a tightening cage in space. For the first time in 30 years of campaigns, the Dravari Dominion fleet was completely encircled. On the bridge of the resolute horizon, Commander Chen watched the same moment unfold with quiet satisfaction. 3 hours, he said. Hale glanced toward him. On schedule. Exactly. Chen enlarged the tactical projection. The Dravari fleet icons were now clustered tightly in the center of the display. Human ships formed a massive sphere around them. Every direction blocked. Every retreat route covered. They can still fight, Reyes said. Chen nodded. They will. The Dravari had lost ships during the battle, but most of their fleet was still intact. Still dangerous. Still capable of inflicting heavy damage. But their strategic advantage was gone. For the first time in their expansion campaign, they were no longer the ones controlling the battlefield. Back on the Iron Dominion, General Drawl studied the display silently. He had commanded wars for over 2 decades. He had faced desperate defenders, massive fleets, last stands, but he had never experienced this. His fleet had been maneuvered, controlled, guided step by step into a position where every option was suddenly terrible. 300 Dravari ships now sat inside a sphere of nearly 500 human vessels. Any attempt to break through would expose multiple flanks at once. Even a victory would cost catastrophic losses. Drawl understood mathematics. He understood risk. And he understood when a battle had already been decided. He looked at the surrounding ships again. Human vessels. A young civilization. Barely 80 years among the stars. Yet they had done what 12 other civilizations had failed to do. They had stopped the Dominion. Drawl straightened slowly. Open a channel to the fleet, he ordered. The communication officer obeyed. The entire Dravari fleet waited for his command. For a moment, Drawl said nothing. Then he spoke. All vessels, he said calmly. Prepare for withdrawal. Across the battlefield, the massive Dravari formation began turning slowly away from Aveyron. Not fleeing in panic, but retreating. For the first time in 30 years, the Dominion had chosen to leave a world unconquered. For several minutes after the Dravari fleet began withdrawing, no one on Aveyron moved. Across the command centers, the cities, and the underground shelters where thousands of civilians had gathered, people watched the tactical displays in stunned silence. The red enemy icons on the screens were moving away, slowly at first, then faster as the Dravari ships accelerated toward the edge of the system. On the bridge of the Avery flagship Silver Horizon, Captain Thera Valen stared at the display as if she did not quite trust what she was seeing. Confirm the movement, she said quietly. Her sensor officer ran the scans again. They're disengaging, he said. Thera leaned forward. Completely. Yes, Captain. Their formation has broken. They're leaving the system. The words seemed unreal. For hours, the Avery fleet had been preparing for the final stage of the battle, the point where their defenses would collapse and the Dravari bombardment would begin. Instead, the impossible had happened. The enemy was retreating. On the surface of Aveyron, the same realization spread slowly. In the underground shelters beneath the capital city of Illyra, families huddled together around emergency screens showing the orbital battle. For a long time, the images had been terrifying. Flashes of weapons fire, defense platforms exploding, enemy ships closing in on the planet. But now something had changed. The red icons representing the Dravari fleet were shrinking, moving outward. One by one, they crossed the outer sensor boundary and disappeared from the display. The sky above the planet began to clear. A child in one of the shelters pointed at the screen. They're going away, she said softly. An older man beside her nodded slowly. Yes, he replied. They are. In the embassy command center, Elder Valeth stood at the observation window overlooking the city. Behind him, the room buzzed with quiet activity as officers confirmed the final sensor readings. The Dravari fleet had fully withdrawn. 300 warships had entered the Averon system, and now they were gone. Valeth closed his eyes for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming relief that followed the end of a battle he had believed they could not survive. A young communications officer approached him. Elder, she said gently. Yes. The human fleet is requesting permission to open a direct communication channel. Valeth turned from the window. Of course, he said. Put them through. High above the planet, the Resolute Horizon held position at the center of the human fleet. Hundreds of ships had begun regrouping after the battle. Damage reports were coming in. Several vessels had taken heavy hits. A few ships had been lost, but the fleet still held its formation, still stood between Averon and the empty darkness where the Dravari fleet had once been. On the bridge, Admiral Hale sat quietly in the command chair as the communications officer activated the channel. A moment later, the image of Elder Valeth appeared on the screen. The Avery leader looked older than Hale had expected. Tall, silver-skinned. His calm blue eyes studied the human commander carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Valeth bowed his head slightly. Admiral, he said. His voice carried a quiet gravity. On behalf of the people of Averon, thank you. Hale nodded. You're welcome. Valeth glanced briefly at the tactical display behind Hale, showing the hundreds of human ships still in orbit. You arrived quickly, he said. We did our best, Hale replied. Valeth hesitated for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been on his mind since the battle ended. May I ask something, Admiral? Of course. Valeth folded his long hands together. There are many civilizations in this region of space, he said slowly. Most of them heard our distress signal. He looked directly into the camera. But you were the ones who came. There was a quiet pause. Why? On the bridge of the Resolute Horizon, several officers exchanged glances. Hale leaned slightly forward in his chair. That's a fair question, he said. He was silent for a moment. Then he answered. About 90 years ago, he said, humanity had a problem. Valeth listened without interrupting. It was a disease, Hale continued. We called it the Helios Plague. Something flickered in Valeth's eyes. Recognition. Hale noticed it. Yes, Hale said quietly. You remember. Valeth nodded slowly. That was a long time ago. For you, maybe, Hale replied. For us, not so long. Hale stood from his chair and walked slowly toward the large viewport at the front of the bridge. Below them, the green curve of Averon turned gently through space. A peaceful world, very close to becoming another ruin in the long list of Dravari conquests. When the Helios Plague spread through our colonies, Hale said, we asked for help. He folded his hands behind his back. We asked everyone. His voice remained calm. But most civilizations couldn't help us. He glanced briefly toward the communication screen. And some simply didn't want to. Valeth lowered his gaze slightly. The story was beginning to sound familiar. Hale continued. Then one day a data transmission arrived. No introduction. No political message. Just research. The Admiral turned back toward the screen. Medical analysis. Immune system models. Treatment protocols. Exactly what our scientists needed. The bridge remained quiet. Hale spoke the next part more softly. It came from Averon. Valeth was very still. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he sighed quietly. That research was not meant to cause political difficulties, he said. Hale gave a small smile. We know. The Avery elder looked back at him. You studied the records. We did, Hale replied. He gestured lightly toward the tactical displays surrounding the bridge. When that data saved our people, someone made a decision. What decision? Valeth asked. Hale answered simply. That we would remember. The Avery elder closed his eyes briefly. The rain had begun falling outside the embassy windows on Averon. Soft, steady drops tapping gently against the glass. Valeth spoke again after a moment. We never intended it as a bargain, he said quietly. Hale nodded. We know. Valeth looked up. We helped because people were dying. And that, Hale said, is exactly why we came. For a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation filled the silence. Finally Valeth asked one more question. You remembered this for 90 years. Hale shrugged slightly. Humans are stubborn. A few quiet smiles appeared among the officers on the bridge. Hale continued, "Billions of our people are alive today because someone on this planet decided to send that research." He gestured toward the world below. "We didn't know your names, but we knew where the help came from." Valeth sat back slowly. For a long time he said nothing. Then he spoke again. "There is a word in our language," he said carefully. "It doesn't translate well into other languages." "What does it mean?" Hale asked. Valeth thought for a moment. "It describes a bond that forms between people who help one another, even when neither of them expected anything in return." He looked back at the human admiral. "I thought that bond had been forgotten." Hale shook his head. "Not by us." The two leaders sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Valeth bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he said again. Hale nodded. "Any time." 3 days after the battle, the Galactic Concord Council convened an emergency session. The meeting chamber aboard the Concorde's central station was enormous. A circular hall surrounded by tiers of seating where representatives of dozens of civilizations gathered to debate matters affecting thousands of star systems. On this day, every seat was filled. News of what had happened at Averon had spread quickly across the region. The Dravari Dominion, an empire that had conquered 12 civilizations without ever retreating, had been forced to withdraw. And the force responsible had not been a Concorde fleet. It had been humans, a species that most council members had barely considered politically relevant. The chamber hummed with quiet conversation as diplomats reviewed battle reports and sensor logs. The data was undeniable. 482 human ships had entered the Averon system. 3 hours later, the Dravari fleet had retreated. For the first time in 30 years, the Dominion had failed to conquer a world. At the center of the chamber stood the council's presiding officer, Ambassador Terrell of the Vascari Empire. Tall and thin, with polished black skin and bright golden eyes, Terrell had served as Concorde moderator for nearly a decade. He raised a slender hand. The room gradually fell silent. "We are gathered," he began calmly, "to discuss the recent military intervention conducted by the United Earth Defense Command within Concorde territory." A large holographic screen activated behind him. The image of Admiral Jonathan Hale appeared. The transmission came directly from the bridge of the Resolute Horizon, which still maintained orbit above Averon. Hale stood calmly in uniform as dozens of alien diplomats studied him. Ambassador Terrell inclined his head slightly. "Admiral Hale," he said, "your fleet engaged the Dravari Dominion without authorization from this council." His tone remained polite, but the implication was clear. "You intervened in a military conflict involving a Concorde member civilization," Terrell continued. "This action raises serious concerns regarding interstellar law and the balance of power in this region." Several council members murmured in agreement. Others remained silent. Everyone waited for Hale's response. The human admiral did not appear particularly troubled. He folded his hands behind his back. "Yes," he said, "we did." The chamber grew still again. Ambassador Terrell continued, "Your government was not requested to intervene through official Concorde channels." Hale nodded. "That's correct." "Then why," the ambassador asked carefully, "did you deploy nearly 500 warships into Concorde territory?" Hale glanced briefly at the council representatives seated around the chamber. Then he spoke. "Because someone asked for help." The room remained quiet. Several diplomats shifted in their seats. Terrell responded slowly. The Concorde was already reviewing the Averon situation. Hale tilted his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "I saw that." Another quiet ripple moved through the chamber. The admiral continued calmly. "I also saw the records of the previous 12 civilizations that requested assistance from this council." A new document appeared on the chamber's central display. A list of names. 12 civilizations. Beside each one was a short note from Concorde archives. "Pending review." "Under discussion." "Diplomatic concern expressed." And beside those entries, the dates those civilizations had fallen to the Dravari Dominion. The chamber became very still. Hale looked directly at the camera. "You're welcome to sanction us if you believe we've violated your procedures," he said evenly. "But understand something." He paused. Then he finished the thought. "The next time someone sends a distress signal, we're going to answer it." No one in the council chamber spoke, because every representative present understood exactly what that meant. Humanity had just announced a new policy to the galaxy, and it was very simple. When someone called for help, humans would come. 1 year later, the The sky above Aveyron was peaceful again. The twin moons rose slowly over the capital city of Illyra, casting soft silver light across the river that ran through its center. The scars from the Dravari attack had mostly been repaired. Buildings had been rebuilt. Defense platforms had been upgraded. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm. Children played along the riverbanks again. Music drifted through the evening air. And in the center of the city, a new monument stood in the main plaza. It was not large. The Avery had never been a people who admired grand displays. The monument was simple. A sphere of polished stone represented a planet. Beside it, carved into a tall panel of pale crystal, was the image of a single signal line extending outward into the stars. At the end of that line was a small symbol, an open hand. Below it, two inscriptions had been etched, one in the flowing language of the Avery, the other in English. The words were short. They heard us. They came. Elder Valeth stood quietly near the monument as the dedication ceremony ended. Hundreds of citizens had gathered to watch the unveiling. Some of the human officers who had fought in the battle had returned for the occasion as well. Admiral Hale stood near the edge of the crowd with several members of his crew. Neither side made a great show of the moment. That wasn't necessary. The meaning of the monument spoke clearly enough. After the ceremony ended, Valeth walked slowly toward Hale. The human admiral greeted him with a small nod. "It looks good," Hale said, glancing at the monument. Valeth followed his gaze. "It is not meant to celebrate victory," the elders said. "What is it meant for?" Valeth thought for a moment. "Memory." Hale smiled slightly. "That's a good reason." Across the plaza, a young Avery soldier stood watching the monument. Her name was Teva, and she had been stationed at the communications tower during the battle. She had been the one who first noticed the strange signal that came from Earth. Now she held a small data tablet in her hands. An application form. At the top of the screen were the words, United Earth Defense Command, Interstellar Officer Training Program. She had submitted the application that morning, because when the Dravari fleet had filled the sky above her world, someone had answered their call, and she wanted to become the kind of person who did that. Far away in human space, aboard the Resolute Horizon, Admiral Hale received a new message. A distress signal. Different coordinates this time. Different species. The translation software struggled slightly with the unfamiliar language, but the meaning was clear. Ships were surrounding their world. They had no allies nearby. They were asking for help. Hale read the message once. Then he looked up at the stars beyond the viewport. "Plot the course," he said calmly. Around the ship, the crew began preparing for another jump. Because somewhere out there, in the vast darkness between the stars, someone had called for help, and humanity had already decided what it would do when that happened.